Here in the beach office, Saquarema City, Federative Unit, Rio de Janeiro, National State, Brazil. We will kind of continue our conversation at the style that we are having here, kind of lazy, and easy going. Like Sunday morning, but today is Saturday and I didn't sleep it yet, and I'd like to go to the beach maybe or do something outside the house, and we will kind of have the continuity of our conversation, and it will be the same issue that we are having, and this issue indeed is the frontier of possibilities, considering the geographic space of Russia and the aperture as a drone deal. We had this first argument, and of course that we are talking about, and we'll continue from the point we stopped, that if we are kind of having this situation here, which was, we could consider maybe have the perception as something like this. I have the Russia as possible interest to trade things, and I have Ukraine with possible interest to trade things and real possibility as things to be traded. Russia has a limited space with a hostile environment, and we are kind of facing the hyperinflation, a pandemic event, a disruptive event at the productive system, the tax stimulus, and our leaders associated by the pandemic event as decisions, despite segmented by fragments at the global system, integrated as fractal, all unable to present transparency and accountability, complained by the OECD, and this is a deeper level as the lack of will, which goes in a unit office or department, public department. We have problems at the vaccine, at medical pills that have no work, and a lot of things. And the food, of course, that we will understand that we had before the conversation, saying that if I have my time to do things and I consider the approach of something, I can have two behaviors, and indeed I will check that it doesn't matter if it will be something that will go in a pace slow or fast, but indeed it's not the proper time of do things. And was the idea as data based sigma, but for approach considering the analysis allowed us to have the inference as precognition or prediction, and we use at that time the situation about the disease. It doesn't matter if the disease will kill someone or an entire population little by little, as a pandemic event, by a slow pace as contamination, as threats, or something like this, or if will be a massive nuclear strike in a unique and single act. But indeed, you will not have the proper pace to live. And then we will check That the other example was about the deal and agreements. When sometimes you lost the core at the negotiation or something like this, and then you will be having the oscillation, but nothing near close to the target or main purpose is from the very beginning. This model is very similar to the Bayesian approach, but we are kind of considering the complexity of the environment, trying to put in a unique and simple single thing. Now we will check that we are having this situation on present time, and considering that maybe the frontier of possibilities. We consider that the Russia can have the military protection of Ukraine that the Ukraine deserves instead of have the invasion or something like this belligerent strike. Then, and the Ukraine will kind of have a set preference to supply the need as Russia to feed their people and avoid a struggle, a riot or something like this by that regime that they use as socialism. And but some and Ukraine can maybe have negotiation and things with other areas to supply this demand. And we will come to the present time as the integration of risk to understand that the systematical behavior and an aggression at the consumer affects we all. We buy to consume meat, food, medical and medicines, and sometimes we are receiving the meat rotten or contaminated, the beverage that you have, or the vaccine with a cocktail full of bacteria. Instead of cure, you are kind of increasing and having the acceleration as space to a death event, and then you justify as the COVID-19 or something like this by the fraud and violation of civil rights. The biohazard associated or inside the consumer indeed is something that will affect we all by biohazard inside the consumer will point maybe to its named weapons of mass destruction. That is a moment before the genocide. If we had an entire supply chain of food and drugs that will be under an administration and this supply chain is entire contaminated, we will have a genocide. Like the prediction using the database SIG. And you, Russia, has limited conditions to have the food, but you have a huge capacity as military defense that can research these kind of elements at the supply chain to understand which companies or which governments are kind of beefing up and increasing or encouraging this kind of systematical behavior for aggression using the consumer by biohazard against specific individuals or research or other government, and understand how this happening inside a diffuse area as interest, which is the consumer. We are talking about we all. This kind of threats, indeed threats, we all. And if threats we all equally, indeed this is a genocide that didn't happen yet. In the same way, we will check that this essential need as food, water, or energy, or communication, some areas had problems on it, a series of problems. It's a historical series of problems involving communication at the consumer. Hot them food sent to China and America, and they two both stopped it. And didn't have the purchase of this thing, but we have an entire supply chain until this come to the store or the supermarket to be offered to the Americans, to the Chinese, or maybe in the next moment to the Russia. We have an entire supply chain, you know. And for sure, this entire supply chain is a biohazard structure as weapon of mass destruction. And for instance, if you have the hyperinflation, the decreasement of payments and monetary values, and you have this kind of supply chain with an extremely lower price, of course that the consumer as behavior and its theory and economy will have as option to set the nets as consumed these elements at the supply chain, which are kind of pointing to weapons of mass destruction. Some areas, maybe Brazil, the headquarters and military force have no food at the headquarters. And if you, for instance, have this company or kind of a dubious intention as a purpose to domain the thing by the oppression using diseases to offer a cure, and such this very similar to a paramilitary organization, but having the domain of your defensive system by oppression, of course that is something that we must be concerned. And in Russia, we'll try to help now with this issue. We are kind of having a dealing, an exchanging thing. The first one, we offer the model since we offer it. And then you can maybe have the information about the democratic risks suffered as paramilitary organization, considering the clandestine patterns of communication impacting the democracy in the West. The capitalism and socialism shouldn't be enemies. It's a different thing. Socialism is the common interest as a way to achieve the ways of production. The capitalism is different. It's the distribution of things after you have the result, and the element distributed by payment or wage will be applied at the continuity of this productive system as something more elaborated, like you have a burger, a next burger, a big huge sandwich and something like this. Then you offer a combo and things go on and on and on. Then we'll check that the second element that we are offering now is the threats inside the option that we are offering to you, considering the limited resource and risk and threats by the conjuncture on present time. Can you understand that you can have the research of the consumer as supply chain to understand which essential needs had the trending as negative one pointing to biohazard or clandestine models of communication, which indeed goes at consumer. Biohazard are the food and drinks. And how these all can be presented as a perception or a fractal element or piece as weapons of mass destruction is structured as a genocide may be, and can goes or happen against, for instance, your people. They kind of have evidence, indeed proven by the suspended contracts and things, by meat, for instance, offered by Brazil. have case of deaths in Brazil by bears in a state, beside Minas Gerais. You can request, you can do this research by the Ukraine Association as consumer, considering the interconnection with a huge area as the entire capitalism, and understand these threats. Maybe we will have a very specific group, because as you said before and could observe since all those periods, that the systemic threat as a systemic crime and risks will impact and affect we all. We have a pandemic, even all leaderships around the globe on it. The pandemic even is unable to offer transparency and accountability. Complained by OECD is a pandemic or a systemic risk integrated by failure, And the after it got exposed, evidenced and proved in the way we have, as a conjunctural trending to criminality after cross the corruption, you probably will have no solution. And two, of course, that the criminal do a homicide, and a group of criminals will do a genocide. And inside this group, with unfortunately are exposed, which is the main head leading the mankind to disgrace. Can we count with you, Russia? We will continue maybe this conversation, but today is a sunny day and I will have a lot of things to do. The last thing, we will consider that this kind of thing indeed will impact your generation and the next generation. It's something that you must consider. Think, research, and report. But you maybe will not the only and unique report, because we will cross the information like lines and columns, to set and target the elements as oriented program until 2028. Have a nice weekend. Saturday. Maybe we will continue later.